By the year 66 of the Common Era, the province of Judea had become an open wound in the side of the Roman Empire. Decades of mismanagement by incompetent and avaricious procurators men who saw the province merely as a source of personal enrichment had pushed the population to its breaking point. Tensions that had simmered for generations, fueled by religious zealotry and crippling taxation, finally erupted into open violence in the streets of Jerusalem. What began as riots against the abuses of the governor, Gessius Florus, rapidly coalesced into a full-scale national revolt. The Roman garrison in the city was overrun and slaughtered. The act was irreversible. The Judeans had declared war on the greatest power the Mediterranean world had ever known. The initial Roman response was brutal, swift, and catastrophic. Cestius Gallus, the imperial legate of Syria, marched south with over 30,000 troops, intent on crushing the rebellion in its infancy. He reached Jerusalem and even burned its northern suburb, Bezitha. The rebellion seemed on the verge of collapse. Yet, for reasons that historians still debate, perhaps fearing the onset of winter, or perhaps disheartened by the fierce resistance along the walls, Gallus ordered an inexplicable retreat. It was a fatal error. As the heavy Roman columns lumbered back towards the coast, navigating the treacherous, narrow pass of Beth Horon, the Judean rebels launched a devastating ambush. Attacking from the high ground, the rebels turned the disciplined Roman withdrawal into a panic. The 12th Legion Fulminata, the Thunderbolt, was decimated. 6,000 Roman soldiers were killed. Their baggage train, their artillery, and most disgracefully, their legionary eagle were captured by the insurgents. The news shocked the empire. The invincible legions had been humbled by a provincial rabble. In Rome, the Emperor Nero understood that this was no longer a mere police action. The prestige of the empire itself was at stake. To restore order, he needed a man who understood the grim mechanics of total war. The man chosen for this task was Titus Flavius Vespasianus. Vespasian was not an aristocrat born into luxury. He was a career soldier, a pragmatic and ruthless general who had earned his reputation conquering the tribes of southern Britain. In early 67 AD, he arrived in Ptolemais, assembling an immense force of 60,000 men, including 3 full legions, the 5th Macedonica, the 10th Fretensis, and the 15th Apollinaris. He did not rush directly to Jerusalem. Instead, with cold methodological patience, Vespasian began a systematic campaign to isolate the capital. Throughout 67 and 68 AD, he subdued Galilee and the coast, reducing rebel strongholds one by one, driving thousands of refugees before him into the increasingly crowded city of Jerusalem. But as the Roman noose tightened, fate intervened. In June of 68 AD, Nero committed suicide, plunging the Roman Empire into chaos. The following year, 69 AD, would be known as the Year of the Four Emperors, a brutal civil war that saw generals vying for the throne over the corpses of their rivals. Vespasian suspended military operations in Judea to observe the political storm in Rome. Eventually, the legions of the East declared him emperor. Vespasian departed for Rome to claim his title, leaving the completion of the Judean campaign in the hands of his eldest son, Titus. Titus was young, ambitious, and desperate to prove himself worthy of being the emperor's heir. He inherited a war that was already won in strategic terms, but the final bloody act remained. By the spring of 70 AD, the empire was stabilized, and the new Flavian dynasty needed a spectacular victory to cement its legitimacy. Titus turned his full attention to the isolated capital of Judea. He gathered his 4 legions and marched on the holy city. Inside the walls, Jerusalem was tearing itself apart with factional fighting, oblivious to the terrifying unity of purpose approaching from the coast. The waiting was over. The final storm was about to break. Titus arrived at Jerusalem in April of 70 AD, coinciding with the feast of Passover. The timing was catastrophic for the defenders. The city, which normally housed perhaps 30 or 40,000 residents, was now swollen with pilgrims from across the diaspora. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children had flocked to the temple to offer sacrifices, unaware that they were walking into a cage. As the Roman vanguard appeared on the horizon, the gates were sealed. What was intended as a holy gathering instantly transformed into a logistical nightmare. The Romans did not need to fight every soul inside the walls. They simply needed to wait for the inevitable arithmetic of starvation to take hold. But Titus was young, and he was impatient. He did not want a years-long blockade. He wanted a triumph. He deployed his forces with terrifying precision. The 12th and 15th legions were ordered to take position on the northern flank, while the 5th Macedonica encamped near them. But it was the 10th Legion, Fretensis veterans who harbored a deep bitterness from previous Jewish ambush, who took the most strategic position. They occupied the Mount of Olives, looking directly down into the temple courtyards from the east. From the city walls, the defenders could see the sunlight glinting off thousands of helmets and pila. The surrounding hills, once covered in olive groves and gardens, were stripped bare by Roman engineers to build siege camps. The beautiful landscape was rapidly converted into a machine of war, a ring of iron and wood designed to strangle the city. Yet, as the Roman noose tightened, the response from within Jerusalem was not unity, but madness. The city was not controlled by a single government, but was fractured between rival warlords who hated each other almost as much as they hated the Romans. In the temple precincts held John of Giscala, a deceptive and ruthless leader supported by the Zealots. Controlling the upper city was Simon Bar Giora, a charismatic populist who commanded the largest force. Between them stood smaller, radical factions. Instead of preparing the defenses, these groups had spent the months leading up to the siege fighting a brutal civil war in the streets. They slaughtered each other's fighters and tormented the civilian population, accusing anyone who spoke of negotiation of treason. In one of the most tragic acts of the entire war, the rival factions, in an attempt to cut off each other's supplies, set fire to the city's grain silos. These storehouses contained years' worth of food, enough, perhaps, to outlast the Roman patience. In a single stroke of fratricidal rage, the food was reduced to ash. When Titus looked upon the city, he saw smoke rising not from Roman artillery, but from Jewish torches. The defenders had effectively defeated themselves before the first battering ram ever touched the walls. As the Passover concluded, the pilgrims found themselves trapped in a city that had already destroyed its own means of survival. The siege began not with a charge, but with a bombardment. Titus ordered the artillery to clear the battlements of defenders. The legions possessed a terrifying array of war machines, 340 catapults and ballistae. The day and night, they hurled bolts and heavy stones weighing up to a talent roughly 26 kilograms into the city. The impact of these stones could shatter masonry and liquefy human bodies. At first, the white limestone projectiles were visible against the dark sky, giving the Jewish sentries a moment to scream a warning. The stone is coming. But the Romans, adapting quickly, blackened the stones with soot to make them invisible in the night. The walls were pounded with a relentless rhythmic violence, a thunder that denied the city any sleep. Under the cover of this iron rain, the Roman engineers brought forward the true instruments of the breach, the battering rams. Massive iron-headed beams, suspended within covered sheds to protect the operators, began their work on the third wall, the outermost defense of the city. The sound was maddening, a repetitive, dull thud shaking the foundations of the earth. The defenders, realizing that the stone would eventually yield, resorted to suicidal bravery. They did not cower. They opened the gates and charged. Jewish fighters, armed often with little more than swords and torches, sprinted across the open killing ground, throwing themselves against the Roman siege towers in desperate attempts to set them on fire. It was a clash of two distinct forms of warfare, the cold, mechanical discipline of the legion versus the frantic, spiritual fury of the zealot. On the 25th of May, the third wall collapsed. The Romans poured through the breach, securing the northern suburb of Bezetha. But there was no time to celebrate. The second wall awaited them. Here, the fighting shifted from open ground to the claustrophobic terror of urban combat. When the Romans breached the second wall 5 days later, they surged into the narrow, winding markets of the lower city. It was a trap. The Jewish defenders, knowing the terrain, swarmed from the alleys and rooftops, cutting off the Roman vanguard. For hours, the disciplined legionaries were reduced to a panicked mob, unable to form ranks in the tight streets, struck down by invisible enemies. Titus was forced to order a retreat, abandoning the breach to regroup, a rare tactical humiliation for the future emperor. It took 4 more days of grinding, methodical combat to retake the second wall and demolish it entirely. Now, the city lay exposed. The Romans stood before the final, most formidable line of defense, the ancient first wall and the towering Antonia fortress. The easy victories were over. The legions stopped to catch their breath, staring up at the heights of the Temple Mount, realizing that the defenders were not breaking. They were merely retreating into the harder, holier core of the city, preparing to die for every inch of stone. By June, the siege had devolved into a gruesome stalemate. The Roman engineers had spent weeks constructing massive siege ramps against the Antonia fortress, piling up tons of earth and timber to bring their machines within striking distance. But the defenders were not idle. John of Giscala, displaying a terrifying ingenuity, had his men dig a mine beneath the Roman ramps, shoring it up with wood and pitch. On the day the Romans prepared to assault, the Jews set the mine ablaze. The ground suddenly opened up, and the Roman ramps collapsed into a fiery pit, taking the siege engines with them. It was a crushing psychological blow. Titus, realizing that brute force was costing too much time and too many lives, convened his generals. If the city would not fall to the sword, it would be forced to kneel by hunger. He ordered the construction of a circumvallation wall, a continuous barrier to seal Jerusalem off completely from the outside world. The efficiency of the Roman legions was never more terrifying than in this moment. The soldiers, driven by a competitive fury, completed the wall in just 3 days. It was nearly 5 miles long, fortified with 13 forts. With the final stone placed, the psychological noose snapped shut. There was no longer any hope of reinforcement, no hope of supply, and crucially, no hope of escape. Any Jew caught trying to flee the city to forage for roots or grass was captured. To terrorize the defenders, Titus ordered these captives crucified in view of the walls. Josephus records that the soldiers, out of rage and hatred, nailed the prisoners in different postures for their own amusement, until there was no more space for the crosses and no more crosses for the bodies. 500 people a day were tortured to death in plain sight of their families on the battlements. Inside the sealed city, the famine deepened from a shortage into a horror story. The grain destroyed in the Civil War was now a distant, bitter memory. The population began to eat leather belts, shoes, and the hay from old mattresses. The social order did not just fracture, it evaporated. The faction fighters, the self-proclaimed defenders of the city, transformed into wolves. They burst into homes, not to fight Romans, but to search for hidden scraps of food. If they saw a person who looked healthy, they tortured them, assuming they were hoarding grain. If they saw a person dying, they robbed them of their last morsel. The streets became clogged with the dead. The bodies were too numerous to bury, so they were simply tossed over the walls into the ravines, creating a moat of putrefying flesh that shocked even the Romans. It was in this atmosphere of absolute desperation that the most infamous atrocity of the siege occurred, a story that would haunt historical memory for millennia. A noblewoman named Mary of Bethezuba, driven mad by the agony of starvation and the ceaseless plundering of her home by the rebels, committed the unthinkable. She took the infant son nursing at her breast, killed him, and roasted him. When the rebels smelled the scent of cooking meat and burst in, demanding their share, she uncovered the remains of her child and offered them the rest. The hardened warriors, men who had waded through blood for months, recoiled in horror and fled the house. The city had become a place where the living envied the dead. The prophecy was fulfilled. Jerusalem was eating its own heart. In late July, the Antonia fortress fell. The Romans did not take it with machines, but with stealth. Under the cover of darkness, a small group of legionaries scaled the ruins of the wall, slew the sleeping sentries, and sounded a trumpet. The Jewish defenders, believing the entire Roman army was upon them, fled in panic into the temple precincts. Titus immediately ordered the fortress razed to the ground. He needed a flat surface, a paved road of stone, to roll his war machines directly onto the sacred platform of the Temple Mount. The physical barrier between the profane world of the legions and the holiest site in Judaism had vanished. Now, the war was fought in the courtyards of the Lord. The fighting here was different. It was intimate, desperate, and religiously charged. The Jews were no longer fighting for a city. They were fighting for the house of God, but the omens were dark. On the 17th of Tammuz, the daily sacrifices, the Tamid, ceased for the first time in centuries. There were no lambs left, and no priests free of blood to offer them. The heartbeat of the nation had stopped. Titus, still hoping to preserve the magnificent structure as a trophy of his victory, sent Josephus to the walls to plead for surrender. The only answer was jeering and a hail of arrows. The Romans pressed forward, burning the porticos that surrounded the court, turning the colonnades into a ring of fire that illuminated the nights. The stage was set for the final tragedy. On the 10th of August, the 9th of the Jewish month of Av, the very same date on which the first temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians, 600 years earlier, the end arrived. The legions had been engaged in a furious skirmish near the inner gates. In the heat of the melee, a Roman soldier, reportedly without orders and moved by what Josephus called a divine impulse, snatched a piece of burning timber. Being hoisted up by a comrade, he hurled the flaming brand through a small golden window into the sanctuary's adjacent chambers. The dry, aged cedar wood caught instantly. The fire did not smolder. It roared. Titus rushed to the scene. According to the histories, he shouted to his soldiers to extinguish the flames, even beating some of them with his staff to enforce obedience. He wanted the temple taken, not destroyed, but the legions were beyond command. Driven by the frenzy of battle, the hatred of the enemy, and the glitter of the gold that lined the sanctuary walls, they pretended not to hear him. They fueled the fire, throwing more torches into the Holy of Holies. The slaughter that followed was absolute. 10,000 Jews were cut down on the temple steps. The blood reportedly ran so thick it quenched some of the fires. The screams of the dying, magnified by the acoustics of the burning mountainside, echoed off the surrounding hills, making it seem as if the earth itself was crying out. As the roof of the sanctuary collapsed with a thunderous crash, the connection between the Jewish people and their divine center was severed. The temple was gone. With the temple in ruins, the spiritual heart of the rebellion had stopped beating, but the physical body of the resistance still twitched in the upper city. This was the wealthy quarter, the home of the aristocracy and the priesthood, located on the western hill. The surviving faction leaders, Simon Bar Giora and John of Giscala, retreated here, refusing the final offer of surrender. They demanded safe passage into the desert. Titus offered them only a sword. The Romans, now weary and eager to return home, spent weeks building new siege banks against the steep cliffs of the upper city. When the battering rams finally breached the walls in September, the result was anticlimactic. The defenders, hollowed out by months of famine and despair, simply dissolved. There was no last stand. The rebels abandoned their impregnable towers, fortifications the Romans could never have taken by force, and hid in the sewers. The legions poured into the streets of the upper city with swords drawn, but they found mostly corpses. Entire families had died in their homes, frozen in the final embrace of starvation. The soldiers, initially recoiling from the stench, soon turned to their oldest tradition, plunder. They set fire to the houses, burning the dead along with the living who were hiding in the attics. The fire spread until it consumed the entire city. The walls were torn down, stone by stone. Jerusalem, the city of David, the jewel of the East, was methodically erased from the map. Only 3 towers, Fazil, Hippicus, and Mariam, were left standing, preserved by Titus as a monument to the strength of the fortifications he had overcome. The rest was leveled so completely that, as Josephus wrote, future visitors would have no reason to believe that the place had ever been inhabited. The war did not end in Judea. It ended in Rome. In 71 AD, Vespasian and Titus celebrated a magnificent triumph. The streets of the capital were lined with cheering citizens as the spoils of the Jewish war were paraded before them. The massive golden menorah, the table of showbread, and the Torah scrolls objects that had been hidden in the Holy of Holies for centuries were now exposed to the profane gaze of the Roman mob. Behind them walked Simon Bar Giora, the rebel commander, dragged in chains to the precipice of the Capitoline Hill, where he was strangled and thrown down the Gemonian stairs. His death marked the ritual conclusion of the conflict. Rome built the Colosseum with the gold taken from the temple, a massive arena funded by the destruction of a nation. But in Judea, there was only silence. The land was decimated. The temple was never rebuilt. The Jewish people were cast into a new exile, a diaspora that would define their history for the next 2,000 years. The siege of 70 AD was not just a battle. It was a pivot point in human history, the moment when Second Temple Judaism ended and the rabbinic tradition began in the ashes. The legions marched away, leaving behind a shattered province and a lesson written in blood. Against the might of Rome, faith alone was not enough.